We are live.
Yay!
Welcome, everybody, to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Testers. I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. With me today, and many times again in the future, is Caitlin Miller.
Hello. Yeah, I work at Effective Artistry. I'm an LPC, and I am super excited to join, and I hope to be here many times. Fascinating and super fun.
Yeah, Caitlin is one of our staff therapists. There's a bunch of fun acronyms for different types of therapy I think there.
I'm an ABCD. I'm just
Yeah.
kidding.
Well, actually, it's something that I didn't even know until I started training, and I think a lot of people generally don't know, is there isn't actually a therapist license.
Yeah.
Therapy and therapist are kind of broad terms. So some people are counselors, some are social workers, some are clinical psychologists, and some are psychiatrists. Although that last one especially is very rare to do actual therapy these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, back when people were just laying on couches and not looking at their psychoanalyst, that's when psychiatrists were doing therapy.
Yeah, well, a lot of what we were talking about last week or the last few weeks when we're talking about neurodiversity and the medical model and all that stuff, a lot of that has to do with the fact that Freud, all that psychoanalysis stuff did start from that medical model. It was very it was medical doctors for the most part, whereas counseling, what most therapy is from these days, started as a different thing. It started as career counseling, actually. Anyway, Caitlin and I both work at a practice called Effective Artistry. We do individual, couple, family therapy. We specialize in utilizing a neurodiversity affirming approach. We're also connected with some executive functioning coaches for people who are looking for non-therapeutic, non-clinical support. We're in Illinois, so we can only work with, for therapy, we can only work with people who are physically located in the state of Illinois. We're trying to get some laws passed to change that. Have you heard anything about the compact that they're trying to get done, Caitlin? We'll have to talk.
No, sounds good.
There is one instituted that should start taking place, but only 12 or 13 states are signed up, and the Illinois State Legislature is considering it in this session.
Wow.
Anyway.
It would be super fun to work with artists all over the country, especially in hubs like Atlanta, LA, New York.
Yeah, and California and New York are probably going to be the last two to join any kind of
compact.
Yeah. Anyway. So what we do here, this is not therapy. We're both therapists, and we'll talk about things that are theoretically relevant to therapeutic concerns, but we're not doing therapy. We're just having a conversation, and we always pick a topic, which today's topic is just sensory sensitivity. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yep.
But also those of you here, you are free and in fact encouraged even maybe to put your comments into the chat. Caitlin is monitoring the chat for us today. Because wherever we go is where we go. If Caitlin and I are talking, we start on sensory sensitivity and we go somewhere else, then we go there. If we go somewhere else because people are talking about or asking about other things, we go there. But of course, if you have questions about sensitivities and whatever, just communication is about impacting one another. And if you're paying attention to the things that we're saying, then we will be impacting you, and we'll be paying attention to anything we can from you, and it will impact us and what we do in response.
Mm-hmm. Which makes it more fun.
Yeah.
It adds extra elements. So
yeah, a lot of times this thing, especially when nobody's commenting, ends up turning into more of almost a lecture series. But the hope, the ideal is that it's just an open forum, open office hours. Let's sit and talk. A lot of the stuff we're talking about, as we'll see today actually too, is stuff that isn't very well defined. Certainly not in the public consciousness, but not even in official scientific and clinical terms. It's stuff that people are just kind of exploring and trying to figure out. That happens best when we can all do that together. We can all contribute our thoughts. So,
and I kind of like how a lot of neurodiversity feels like it's on the frontier of whatever we want to call it, psychology, sociology, the world, brains, all those things.
It really is frontier is a good term for it, because it's being fought over and people are staking claims, and I don't like all of that. I don't like that way of thinking about it, but it is, it's people are putting out their thoughts about things, and things become more or less, crystallized or fossilized in the public mind. Then it's hard. We talk about language all the time. Once people have an understanding of what a term or something means, it's very hard to get that to change. So then you got to look at finding new language instead. And
Yeah.
anyway,
I like it. It keeps me on my toes as a therapist. Like it makes it more fun. It keeps me awake. So, yeah.
Honestly, I've said in the past, and this is obviously a very provocative statement. I think the field of psychology is counterproductive to what therapy is attempting to accomplish. The more psychology influences a particular therapeutic process, the more detrimental it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Psychology is essentially, at its root, it's the science of trying to understand human behavior and experience and function. It's trying to understand why people experience the things they do and do the things that they do.
And it's interesting because as I've kind of dismantled psychology from my therapy practice, it's just become, at least it seems that it's become quite more effective.
Yeah, I mean, psychology is useful, like a lot of these things, especially stuff that's based on a lot of clinical research and whatever.
Yeah.
It's very useful at scale. It's really not very useful in an individual situation. Like, I don't want a therapist. I do this as a therapist and train people to. I don't want a therapist to come in thinking that they already know stuff about the client, or that if the client is saying something to the therapist is in their head thinking like, sure, they're saying this, but really it's this other thing. The more you think you understand somebody without referencing their own communication to you, the less you are incentivized to pay attention to what they are doing and saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And something I'll talk to about people too is like, two people could come in with the exact same sort of demographics and general concerns, and then the therapeutic approach can be so different because of their use of language and their own uniqueness in general. So I find that fascinating, whereas regular psychology would be like, okay, let's do CBT on your anxiety and challenge these thoughts, and it'll work for everybody. And then the clients that come to us are like, it didn't work for me.
And as with everything, those things are useful to the extent that they're useful. People get benefit from it. It's not about trying to take away from that. It is just the scale that you're working on dictates the tools that you use, right? Like, if you're trying to do something with a lot of people in a short period of time, or design a system that many people have to go through, you're going to want to do the best you can to kind of come to the mean and understand how most people will be impacted by something. But the whole point of individual therapy is that it is one-on-one. If it wasn't, then why are we wasting resources having one person in the room at a time if it's not meant to be completely individualized,
Yeah.
So all these things, I like a lot of CBT, but they're tools to use in different scenarios, Anyway.
Yeah, and something I like about the individualized approach as well is one of the reasons why I chose psychology from opera and photography and other artistic stuff was to do something super complicated, and this one single human mind is so complex, and actually approaching it as it is it's such a challenge, and I love it so much. So,
and that's what neurodiversity affirming means at its core is it's not just words that everybody is unique, which is something everyone will say and acknowledge, but that also means that everybody responds to everything differently, which kind of transitions us into what we're talking about today with sensory sensitivities, because different people respond differently even to the same stimuli. And you got to recognize that and eliminate this idea that people should respond to a certain stimuli in a certain way. Should have something to do with it when you're talking about one person.
Shall I grab some of the questions, Brandon?
Let's start talking about sensory sensitivities. And I do like to start, I know you started to put together an outline a bit. I do like to start usually by kind of defining some of these terms we're going to be using so that we don't have to do caveats as we go along. But yeah, start us off somewhere.
Well, do you want me to start with the questions that were submitted via Twitter?
Sure. Well, what were they?
Yeah. We have there are two of them. One of them is how can parents / caregivers ensure that a child with food aversion / sensitivity to taste or texture is getting a balanced diet? And then the second one was, are there certain types of clothing or fabric that are less likely to cause discomfort?
Both good questions, and we can start with those, but we won't get in. Then afterwards we'll get to like general what is sensitivity and whatever.
Okay.
I don't know. What do you think? Where should we start?
I think we should start with what is sensitivity, because sometimes, Brandon, when you define things, I'm like, oh, I can solve it now because we know what we're talking about. So I think it would be nice to like define it, because a lot of your definitions tend to be like maybe a Venn diagram with other people's definitions, but enough uniqueness that it's worth diving into. I don't know.
Sure. Okay. Well, help me out. This is a conversation, if nothing else, between you and I. So
yeah,
I have a tendency to get a little like esoteric and verbose and whatever. But here's the thing where we start with sensory sensitivities. They're not a sensory issue by the strict definition of the term. So I want to separate out sensation from perception. Those are two different things. They're separate processes. Sensation is your body, my body, all of us as humans, our bodies have sensory organs, sensory apparati, which are sensitive to, they respond to, they are impacted by some type of environmental data, like some type of empirical observable thing that happens in the environment. Mm-hmm. And in response to whatever particular type of thing they respond to, they change. Then they generate signals. And once those signals start getting generated, that's when we're starting to talk about perception. So sensation is an unconsidered process, and you only perceive a fraction of the things that your sensory organs sense. Meaning, like if we do this experiment here, if everyone close your eyes and we'll be quiet for a minute here, using a lot of time terms. In a little bit here, we'll be quiet. But when I stop talking, listen to everything that you can hear. Try to isolate sounds and identify sounds. Some of them are big and obvious you were hearing already. But as you put more effort into it, you should be able to identify some other softer sounds that were just fading into the background before. Maybe that's like the HVAC system in your room, or traffic from however far away outside of the walls. They say that in the world's most soundproof chamber, and you can open your eyes again, that there's about a 20-minute level tolerance for people to be in there, because they start just hearing their own like heartbeat in their ears. It starts kind of driving them crazy.
Yeah.
So you sense far more than you perceive. All those sounds that you just heard when your eyes were closed, those are the result of sound waves striking your eardrums and so on. Those sound waves are coming in whether you notice them or not. But then there's a separate process called perception that dictates which of those things we notice and which we don't.
So, Brandon, are you saying that sensory sensitivities are essentially like nodding, or what would the word be? Nodding towards perception rather than sensing, but like the more colloquial terms we use are sensing?
Yeah, sensory sensitivities are perceptual and or attentional issues, depending on how you want to define it, not sensory issues. They're sensory issues in the fact that they are related to a sense. That's why we call them sensory sensitivities.
So would a way to kind of replace the term be like perceptual sensitivities?
I mean, we can still call it sensory sensitivity. I think that's fine. I want to clarify at the beginning that this isn't about a difference in the physical structure of your sensory organs. Typically speaking, someone with an auditory sensitivity, the structure of their auditory sensory organ, the inner ear and all that stuff, is by and large going to be the same as everybody else's for the most part. So it is a sensory sensitivity in that they are more sensitive to a particular sense, but the reason that they're more sensitive is because of the the perceptive process is passing data through to consciousness, not because their eyes or ears or skin or whatever are structurally different.
Okay.
So that means that if we're wanting to look at how to change things, we can still accurately call them a sensory sensitivity. But if we're wanting to look at how to change things, what we actually are wanting to look at is perceptive and attentional processes, not sensitive processes.
Do you want to go into the difference between perceptual and attentive?
Well, perception is a process and attention is a term for a resource. But they're effectively, of all of the things that you could be conscious of, right? Again, we're only actually consciously aware of a very, very, very small fraction of all the data that we could theoretically be consciously aware of. So attention is our word for that gateway of what things we become conscious of and which ones we don't. The ones that we become conscious of, we say, are things that we've paid attention to. And attentional processes and attentional processes are a subset of attentional processes. It's the processes that dictate which things get admitted into conscious awareness and to what extent, and which things don't. Whereas
so you're saying attentional processes are a subset of perceptual processes?
Yeah, and maybe this is getting like overly nitpicky and splitting hairs, but perception, interestingly, starts in the nerve cells that are adjacent to or connected to the sensory organs. It doesn't start in the brain. Things start getting aligned in complicated ways that I don't even fully understand, much less could like get across. But it's the whole nervous system that's involved in perception. And the point at which, so basically first data gets mapped against what we call perceptual sets. After that, and / as part of that, is when attention starts getting dictated, like which things are most important to notice. It's also good to note that it is not a binary, this is worth noticing, this isn't. Like, you would love to be aware of literally everything. It's just something we have a finite capacity to do.
Or literally nothing.
The organism, were it possible, would prefer to be aware of everything.
Oh, totally.
For survival, right?
Yeah, we would survive other than our bodies eventually breaking down. We would survive lots of things.
Even that joke right there is based on the inherent, like the experience we all have of dealing with sensory information drains some resource, which is finite. Different types drain us to different amounts. This has a lot to do with what people are talking about when they talk about sensitivities, but it is a finite resource. So effectively, those processes are kind of like, think of it as their rank ordering. This is the most important thing to pay attention to, then this, and to what extent. And we just take in as much as we can before we run out. It's not that things below that cutoff are, unimportant. It's we got in as much as we could, starting with the stuff we thought was most important.
So, Brandon, I'm curious, if we're dividing it between attentional and perceptive processes, would you say that attentional are more able to be manipulated by like the person themselves?
No, they're both actually, they both happen pre-consciously, right? Like they're both things that happen before you become conscious. You can't consciously decide what to pay attention to because you can only consider the things which you are already paying attention to.
That reminds me of Sam Harris talking about how free will doesn't exist. But that's maybe a different day.
That's an interesting conversation, although it largely just depends on what you mean when you say free will.
Yeah, exactly.
So, anyway. Yes, we can manipulate these processes. And we'll talk a bit about that, hopefully, if we have time today.
Well, I think to kind of focus more on the question, Brandon, would be like, with the clothing question, are there certain types of clothing or fabric that are less likely to cause discomfort? That kind of reminds me of maybe becoming more aware of the attentional and perceptive processes that are engaged with when you're go ahead.
Conversation is basically that. I think you're exactly right. When we're talking about a sensory sensitivity, what we mean is that for whatever reason, my processes pass data into consciousness at a disproportionately high rate when it comes to a particular category of senses. In other words, sound, right? Auditory data is theoretically useful and valuable. Like we wouldn't have the mechanism to be able to perceive it if it wasn't useful to us, at least theoretically. But not all sound is equally useful, and some sound might not be useful to us at all in any way, right? Like especially these days, the fact that we're all inside, like I can hear the rain outside. That's not super useful information to me right now because I'm inside and it doesn't impact me very much unless I'm considering going outside for some reason. So theoretically, then those processes respond by bypassing that, right? Saying like, okay, that's not super important information, so we don't notice it. But if for some reason those processes are saying, nope, we're going to notice the rain, even though it's not useful to you. We're going to notice all these sounds, even though they are not actually useful information at this moment. And I keep saying to what extent, because that's part of it too. Your whole world can become one sound. The extent, the amount of detail, the depth of attention you can pay to a single thing can be that your entire consciousness is full up just of detail about that single input.
That kind of reminds me of like flow state performance of like music, for example.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on flow state stuff too. And I would say, to me, flow state is, yes, when your entire conscious space, working memory is the term people tend to use in like executive function, whatever. The entire working memory is occupied with bringing in environmental data that is relevant to the task at hand and translating that into adapting behavior and immediately applying those behavioral models or whatever word you want to use. Basically that there's no space for thinking about anything other than what is happening in the moment, including what I'm doing. So it's happening at the fastest optimal pace that a person can manage, and that person is getting the optimal outcome that they can get. Which is a lot like fight or flight. It's kind of the same thing, which, sensitivities are the same. So anyway, when we're saying sensory sensitivity, what we mean is we have distinguished that for a person, there's a particular pattern where they bring in information about a certain kind related to a certain sense a lot more than it is useful to them.
I think that's a great thing to kind of highlight, that it's a lot more than is useful to them.
Which is an impossible thing to like quantitatively measure.
But I have noticed that when you ask clients that, it can kind of, they have like an aha moment.
Right. And it's important to know that this, like everything in neurodiversity, this is not a defect. Because how do we know what data is going to be useful before it is useful? If I feel like, oh man, I'm hearing things, think of it like, picture that you are in a quiet place and you can hear a conversation just at the edge of your hearing, and you really are incentivized that you heard your name or whatever. It's somebody you really want to know what they're talking about, and you focus in all of your attention on trying to pick out the details in that conversation that allow you to say, oh, I think that was that word. I think that was that word, even though it's just these tiny little modifications to the sound waves.
Yeah.
We can all do that. Now imagine that that's what happens even when you're not trying to, and when you don't have any reason to believe that it's super useful to you, that you're just, if somebody is, I don't know, chewing gum in the corner, that it's the same thing as though like you're closing your eyes and focusing in, and it just becomes everything. Now, your brain is doing that. Your nervous system, your processes are doing that because they think, they have reason to believe that the data will be useful to you. And it might, right? Like if in the next moment someone says, what, is anyone chewing gum in here? Well, hey, I know it, right? Or whatever, I don't know. So these things are not wrong by default, which is why we're talking about a pattern of experiences. because in any given instance, who knows if that data is useful or not? It's subjective, first of all, but also it's related to the future, which nobody can know. So that brings me to another thing about sensitivity, is that when people talk about it, they're talking about it only in the downsides. They're saying I'm very sensitive to X because what we notice first, those attentional processes, we notice things which are novel and things which are negative before we notice anything else.
Well, I guess an example of that, Brandon, that I've experienced, and you're welcome to, rebut any of this, is having like visual artist clients who are so perceptive to visual data that they can create just incredible, like jaw-dropping art. And then they might have a concurrent like sensory sensitivity regarding sound. And maybe when they're out at a restaurant, they can hear like all the conversations, and they can hear their friend chewing, and they can hear the beer glasses clinking together, and the light is too bright. And then all of a sudden they're like having kind of like a shutdown, or some people would call it like a panic attack within that. So I guess some terms that...
Notice how you use the term sensitivity when talking about the auditory stuff. Didn't use the sensitivity when talking about the visual stuff.
I think I used the word perception.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that when someone is calling it a sensitivity, almost always what they're talking about is a negative experience of noticing stuff. That's why I'm saying that what we're talking about is noticing, paying attention to data beyond the utility of that data.
Yeah.
Because of course that is paired with, think of like trauma, right? Like if something traumatic happens to you in a room where the walls are painted red, it is possible.
That's always the example I give. That's so funny you just said that. Okay, continue.
I wonder if one of us got it from the other. Anyway, later on in your life, when you enter a room where the walls are painted red, your body may enter a state of panic, fight or flight. And consciously, you might not know why. So the body learns these things. And it's guesses, and it's not always right? Things that hurt us are actually helpful. Things that are enjoyable and feel good can actually be harmful. Not all the time. The vast majority of the time, the sensation matches up with the utility, but sometimes it's off. So this is the same. If, for example, if you are a musician and you are paying very, very close attention to detail about all the auditory data coming in a lot of the time, your body, including the brain and the nervous system as part of your body, may not recognize all the specific contextual factors that make it a time we're supposed to be paying attention to sound at that level of detail, and the times when we're not. So then you're out at the restaurant and it's overwhelming. It has to do with frameworks, and we can talk about that. That's one of the things that you can do to try and help with these sensitivities. But just like everything else, when we look at it through that neurodiversity lens, upsides and downsides. It depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on the context in which you are trying to do it. People with auditory sensitivities also are going to be more sensitive or perceptive to auditory data when it is useful. Like people with auditory here are two things which seem completely unrelated, and as far as I know, nobody's talking about them as being related. That one, auditory sensitivity is a fairly common occurrence with autistic people. Another fairly common occurrence with autistic people is accent matching, that they'll start to take on the tone, the lilt, the patterns of speech of people that they're talking to. Those two things to me are the same. Picking up on a level of auditory detail, and it's impacting the way you think and feel and act, even on levels that you're not consciously aware of.
And maybe they're actors who do like amazing impressions of, random places in the UK or something, and they can put it on their resume.
There's a reason that, like, we've conceptualized this differently, and one really like harmful, like pathological conception of this is the idiot savant, where we're saying, oh, this person is uniquely good at a specific thing and also uniquely bad at a bunch of things, which often those things correlate. And even if they don't, you got to remember that all this stuff draws off of the same resources, that the extent to which I pay attention to sound, well, the resources I'm using for that, the working memory and the attention, are the same things I need to use for any other type of data. So if I'm disproportionately paying attention to sound, I'm disproportionately paying less attention to everything else.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all this is specialization, and
Mhm.
and it does not matter for our purposes why or how this happens. Some element of it may be genetic, some element of it certainly is experiential, organic, like trauma, whatever. Doesn't really matter. We arrive at the conclusion. So the first thing to do with sensory sensitivities, and this will be the like gateway into answering every other question, is to recognize.
I was just gonna do that.
Is that they are completely unique. I have an auditory sensitivity, you have an auditory sensitivity. That doesn't mean it's the same thing.
Yeah.
We're still going to respond to auditory data, like any particular instance of auditory data, we're going to respond differently to that thing. Other things matter. If I listen to heavy metal music, it might sound like noise and be overwhelming to my system. But also, I know a lot of people that I think either identify as or could potentially be identified as autistic who love that kind of music. People with auditory sensitivities who love that kind of music because it is very stimulating once you have a framework for it and it's stopped. There's a difference between noise, which is auditory data that you have not mapped to any useful perceptual set. It's just sound without any form or utility to you.
Yeah.
Versus sound that you have mapped against perceptual sets and frameworks and therefore can make use of. So think of it like this. If you listen to someone speaking a language that you don't speak, it just sounds like noise. Listen to 5 syllables and then try to repeat those 5 syllables. You'll have a hard time remembering what they are because your brain has nothing to log that away against symbolically. But in a language you speak, you can remember whole sentences word for word.
Yeah. So Brandon, are there certain types of clothing or fabric that are less likely to cause discomfort? I'm just gonna throw this out there. What I immediately go to, since I love solving problems, is like experimentation. And an example I can think of is I have a client who either prefers sort of like the athleisure, like polyester, whatever stuff that's going to pollute the oceans that feels like a second skin, or they prefer like super baggy, androgynous kind of like linen fabric. So I don't know. I've just found it interesting to talk to clients who have the sensory sensitivity of the feel of fabric against their skin about like what are the specific ones that cause you more or less distress? And then how can that be optimized? I don't know if that would be kind of like an intervention design.
I mean, the literal answer to the question is yes. And like you're saying, it depends on the person. So you want to look at what that person is experiencing. Again, like we were talking about psychology at the beginning, if we say, oh, this fabric and this fabric and this fabric, and then you go out and you buy it and you try it for your child who's responding to tactile and it doesn't work, then you might think, oh man, well the expert said it's this, so maybe it's not a sensitivity thing, or maybe blah, 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 or whatever.
Oh, well, the thing I was thinking of more is like, what clothing do they already own and how do they respond to the things that,
so with all sensitivity issues, we want to start there. Look at the existing patterns. First of all, look at that type of data and look at where the sensitivity to it, because sensitivity is not a negative thing. In this case, when we're using the word sensitivity, what we mean is sensitive like an instrument is sensitive, like a scale, which is sensitive and therefore measures to the nearest thousandth of a pound, as opposed to one which measures to the nearest pound and is therefore less sensitive. They can both be giving an accurate reading, but the more sensitive one gives more precision. So it's more data about the same input, not more accurate, but more precise. So look at the times where that is useful to the person, because that should theoretically always exist, that there is some time where that amount of data is useful to the person. The only time I could think of that there would be some exception to that would be some relatively recent and very severe trauma where that type of data would theoretically have been useful. But the brain adapts very quickly. If that information is never, never, never useful, pretty soon you start deprioritizing it. So there will be some times where it's useful. So look at that, and then you can start to say, because the key isn't that it's auditory data. They might be sensitive to auditory data across the board, but other variables dictate whether that sensitivity results in an unpleasant experience or a pleasant or useful experience. And you want to start looking at those variables, what makes it different between the two, and you can mess around with those. And yes, the easiest way to start is by looking at just this. What are the things you enjoy? What are the things you dislike related to whatever sense you're talking about?
Yeah.
And just real quick, we won't go into this in detail, but I find it useful also to talk about sensitivity to data by categories other than senses. Like a sensitivity to social data, a sensitivity to data about the weather or whatever, right? Like it doesn't have to just be sensory. These are just the most commonly talked about.
Can you give an example of how to break down questions like that regarding the person who's asking about clothing?
Yeah, so when we're talking about clothing, if we're talking about a sensory sensitivity, as opposed to like a fashion sensitivity or whatever, which might be related to social feedback and et cetera. But generally, we're talking about a tactile sensitivity, sensitivity to the feedback of pressure and movement against the skin and such. I have a tactile sensitivity, which is why I'm doing this. Most people, if you are fidgeting in some way that involves some kind of tactile experience, clicking your pens, moving your fingers, et cetera, then you probably have a tactile sensitivity. Now, in negative terms for myself, when it comes to clothing, seams and socks, which is a very common, almost stereotypical sensitivity issue.
Yeah.
I hate seams in socks. It bothers me so much. Like I have a hard time sleeping if I have to sleep on my side, because otherwise if the weight of the blanket is on the tip of my toes, it causes me discomfort. So when you look at something like that, then you can say, A, what things you've already discovered. For me, I buy shoes that I can wear without wearing socks at all. Or if I have to wear socks with shoes, I wear these very low. Here, I'll show them. Maybe this is inappropriate, but
I don't think it is. I think it's cool when people relate it to themselves.
I wear these very low cut socks that don't have a seam. They have I guess they do have a seam, but it's somehow much, much smaller than the seams that I'm wearing. And they're up on top of the toe. They don't go anywhere near the edge of the toenail. That's the thing that bothers me the most, is when it's right around where the toe and the toenail together. These are Adidas. I just had to look them up because I just had to order a new package. Adidas Super.
Brandon, do you secretly have a corporate sponsor and you're not telling us?
They were playing the long game. They were just hoping that eventually it would come up. Now, generally with sensitivities, here is my kind of 4-step process for dealing with sensitivity issues. Number one, what can we do to limit exposure to the type of data that causes the negative sensory issue, the negative sensory sensitivity experience? So in that case, right, that if the seams to the socks are bothering, can we eliminate any sensation related to the seams of socks? If being in noisy spaces bothers you, can we eliminate your need to be in noisy spaces, or at least minimize it? Number one, we always want to start there. Limit the exposure to that data type. And again, not the sensation. We're not limiting your exposure to sound broadly. We're first looking at the variables that make it a negative experience versus a positive or neutral experience, right? And we're limiting your exposure to the things that make it a negative experience. Number two, after we've eliminated and minimized your exposure as much as possible, then we want to look at what things can we do to interpose some barrier between the origin of that sensory stimuli and your sensory organs. So this is where, with an auditory sensitivity, we're talking about headphones, right? Just, I can't stay out of the noisy environment, but I can put something over my ear that makes the sound deadened and less when it comes to my ear. Then number three is when we're going to look at developing frameworks. This, I'm putting at number 3 because it is by far the most resource intensive process. This is the equivalent of, if you're hearing, for auditory sensitivity, imagine that you're in a country where no one speaks the language that you speak. and you're sitting at a restaurant trying to have a conversation with a person that does speak your language, and everyone else around you is speaking a language you don't understand. And because of the acoustics, it's all bombarding you and hitting you, and it makes it very difficult for you to suss out the auditory data that's coming from the person that you understand their language versus all the sources you don't. Well, if you learn to speak that language that everybody else is speaking, then those processes which allow you to filter out signal from noise. Noise is data that's coming in that is irrelevant or useless. Signal is data that is coming in that is useful, theoretically. If I learn to speak that second language, then my processes will be better able to filter out that and isolate the one in front of me, because I can identify those things. Remember, we prioritize novelty, things that we don't know what they are, and negativity, things that might potentially harm us, cause us some kind of problem. So something I don't know that's novel, and I'm much more likely to recognize it. If I can learn about that thing this gets into like, what are the things that we need to put into place to have learning work well? But if I can actually learn about that thing, not just be exposed to it, but actually learn about it, then I'll be more likely to be able to filter it out. But that's learning is a difficult, time-consuming process.
Yeah.
So we want to do it third. And then the fourth thing is not about changing the sensitivity, it's about changing the response. The fourth thing is it's draining, right? Sensing anything, even if it's useful, is draining. It takes some resource. Some versions of utilizing that resource also result in getting some resource back, and it can be enjoyable and energizing. Yeah. But it also involves taking something even when it's giving you something back. So then we want to look at how do we make it so that pool of resources, that you have more of that available to you. Meaning, if we've limited your exposure to it as much as possible, we've interposed as much stuff between you and between your sensory organs and the origin of the stimuli as possible, and we've done as much as we can do, or continuing to do as much as we can do to learn about it, and it's still causing a lot of problems, then we have to look at what other things in your life are taking those resources, and how can we either eliminate some of that or do some more stuff to get you some stuff back, so that you're not, if you're having a meltdown every day from auditory data, and you've done those three things, limited, interposed, and learned as much as you can, then the only thing we can do is say, well, how do we get it so that other things don't drain you and get you to the verge of a meltdown? Or what other things can we do to kind of restore you and buttress you and prepare?
So are you saying, like, if a meltdown is a 10 out of 10 and the auditory sensitivities are a 7 out of 10, then what's that 3 out of 10? And how can we reduce that so it doesn't get you to a 10 out of 10?
I'm saying that if I have an auditory sensitivity, if we're going to put numbers on it, let's say I have 100 points to spend on incoming sensory data. And if I have an auditory sensitivity compared to you, that in an experience where you're spending 1 point per minute on auditory data, I'm spending 10 points per minute on auditory data. And a meltdown is when you hit 0. I've got nothing left to make any sense of incoming data. So what that fourth thing is let's make it so that when you go into this scenario that we can't avoid you going in because we've already tried all that stuff, that you have 40 points left instead of 10 by the time you get there, so that you can survive it as long as possible. That's a last option, and it's still useful. This is a lot of what like ABA is, increasing tolerance things. How can we make it so that you can stand it for as long as possible? It doesn't make it more useful or more pleasant. It just makes it more tolerable. And there's useful for that. ABA does help people, even though I personally and many of us have a huge problem with everything about it. But if there was no value or utility to anyone ever, it wouldn't be done. Let's get straight to that fourth thing where we're trying to increase tolerance instead of do any of that other stuff.
Shall we go to the food aversion question?
Well, to go back to the fabric one first, look at anything that removes the type of data that they're responsive to. And what that's going to tend to be is things which are relatively static, meaning unchanging, I guess, static. The way
that wasn't a pun. Yeah.
So that's like you were mentioning athleisure, right? Things that have compression, that's a lot of data input, but not a lot of novelty. Whereas something like this is not putting data in as much, because there are lots of parts of my skin that it's not touching, but the flip side of that is every time I move, it's now touching me in a different place or in a different way, a different pattern than it was before. So things like athleisure and compression stuff is going to get rid of that novelty issue. Compression stuff drives me crazy. It doesn't bother me when I first put it on, but I have noticed that when I wear things like that, especially around my midsection area, and this is why we don't care about why, because is that because I'm worried I feel fat, or do I hate the idea of appearing to be fat because I hate the idea of something touching my stomach? I don't know. But
or when you were 4 years old, someone told you X, Y, or Z, and Freud is right about everything.
Yeah. Okay. And it doesn't matter. That's the point. We just do what we do. For me, what I've noticed is not a sense of discomfort immediately, but that I go from energized to exhausted a lot more quickly, it seems like, on days where I wear something like that, or we'll be having a perfectly lovely day otherwise, but still start to get anxious and stressed and panicky at a certain point without being able to identify it. And it's really tricky when you're looking at that response to things, because very quickly your brain will start to identify. You'll come up with stuff. If you start feeling stressed and panicky for no identifiable reason, then the very first thing you do is say, why am I stressed and panicky? And you start running through, what could it be? What could it be? And sooner or later, you'll come up with, oh, it's probably because of this thing.
Yeah.
And then say, oh, I'm stressed and panicky because of this thing, even though you were not aware of that thing. And it's very likely there was something else in the environment.
Yeah.
So removing the data. Yeah. And so you're going to want to look at things that make it so that it takes away change and or takes away input at all. Like a lot of autistic people I know, especially in my personal life, especially the young kids, family members and whatever, they are the people. My brother wore shorts. We lived in Utah. Doesn't matter if it was the middle of winter and there's 2 feet of snow, he wore shorts, and he wears flip-flops unless he has to wear something else for work. These kids that they get home from school and they get into their underwear right away, like the shirt and the pants come off right away.
Yeah.
That's just removing any input at all. But yeah, you're going to want things that are relatively consistent. So like single fabric, generally, not like mixed materials, which happens to be compliant with ancient biblical laws about how to wear clothes.
That's what it all is.
And then you just experiment. But yeah, you gotta try it out with different people. But just start by listening to them. And if they can't identify it and verbalize it, just look at patterns of, well, they don't like this kind of stuff. They do tend to like this kind of stuff, and experiment with your theory.
And Brandon, we have about 5 minutes left, since I'm the not father time, I'm mother time.
Okay. So food sensitivity stuff. I don't know what kinds of I don't know enough about fabrics and stuff. So like cotton, or I don't know if like wool or cotton, anything that you would.
And some of them can be blended too and change as well.
You'd want to look at things that would generally be considered to be soft, light. So I don't know what fabrics that is, but that's the scratchy stuff.
A big thing for me, Brandon, too, is like stretchable, like fabrics where no matter what position I'm in throughout the day, I'm just like able to be, and it doesn't
like static, right? That's
static.
Because some people, you put a compression thing or a stretchable thing on them, and it's the volume of data. And I bet at least in our culture, women and men are people who are socialized as one or the other. I would bet it correlates to that, but I don't know. You just experiment.
Yeah.
If they say something scratchy, I'm assuming this is a question on behalf, a parent on behalf of their child. But if it's not, if it's you, just try things out before you buy them. And if it bothers you, or if you happen to notice feeling bad that day, even if you don't think it's related to the thing, try something else, to the best of your ability. All right, sorry, food one. Go ahead.
Do you want me to repeat the question? How can parents or caregivers ensure that a child with food aversions or sensitivity to taste or texture is getting a balanced diet?
Okay. Time. I will say quickly, balanced diet is a tricky concept because there are a lot of variables which dictate what a particular person needs. And so the idea that we can put together a particular set of nutritional frequency and blah, 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 that's all based on scale. It's useful stuff, but it's based on large scale studies, not individual things. And there are individual variations. My middle son does not have galactosemia, but is a carrier for galactosemia and has one recessive gene, which is the thing that makes it so that drinking anything with lactose in it, if you have it fully, basically can kill you. Your body can't process it at all. It just builds up until it hits a certain level of toxicity. His doesn't do that, but it's also not that at all. He processes it apparently at a much slower rate. For some reason, he is very, very avoidant to meat, the texture of meat. It doesn't matter if it's beef, chicken, whatever, unless it's like ground and cooked into something. My oldest son does not like anything touching anything else, no mixture of textures whatsoever. Everything is separate. For his birthday, it's his birthday in a few days, and he wants tortilla, taco meat, shredded cheese, and cucumber all separate. He doesn't like a taco, but he likes a bunch of things that are in a taco.
That's so cute. I'm sorry. I just had to say something. That's adorable.
Before going to too much length, like through too much difficulty to try and force some change in a diet, if you have the means, working with a dietitian to get some more individual information about your kid, but also ask yourself this: what is the problem? Not just, it isn't a balanced diet. Well, because it isn't a balanced diet, then what? Is there something happening that seems to be problematic that you think might be related to the diet and the imbalance in it? Or does everything seem to be fine and nothing's a problem? In which case, it doesn't mean that there might not be some other problem in the future, but no diet you give them would mean that there definitely won't be some problem related to that diet in the future. What we considered to be a healthy diet 20 years ago is very different than what we consider today. And it is all influenced, as we now know, the food pyramid was completely debunked and replaced in large part because it was influenced very heavily by food, like growers and producers lobbying to get their stuff, disproportionate. So don't put too much stress into it if it's not causing some specific problem. If it is causing some specific problem, well, then you have a metric to observe as you experiment with things to see, well, we think this might be because they're not getting enough protein. Let's try getting them more protein and then see what happens, and so on and so forth. So start there. Now, then look at food sensitivity is going to be gustatory. That's the fancy term for taste related, the way that like auditory or visual is gustatory. But more, in my experience, that I've heard about is actually tactile. It tends not to actually be about the taste or the flavor, but about the feel of the food. In which case, like I was just saying, these are just commonly useful things. Separating things out so that you don't have mixed textures, hard stuff in a soft sauce, right? When you're trying to introduce new foods, try and keep it within a specific, like a texture that that they're okay with, right? Like if they like tortilla and you want to, I don't know what something else would be that has a similar thing, but a different nutritional value. I don't know. Just try and keep
I pictured like thinly sliced zucchini or something. I don't know why I thought of that, but
maybe. Another very common thing here is that it's actually about novelty. That, for example, it's not that I can't stand anything new. It's just that something new draws my attention, and I don't like having my attention drawn to what I'm eating. I like, there are certain things, even like universal bodily functions, that for anybody, if you make them focus on it, they're going to be squicked out by their own bodily processes, right? Mm-hmm. So it's possible that paying attention, having my attention drawn to the process of chewing, even as I'm saying that, some of you are probably getting squicked out by it, of chewing and mashing up food and eating and swallowing. I just don't want to notice it. And anything novel draws my attention to it. In that case, you might be able to look at, do things like stimming or fidgeting or whatever to draw their attention elsewhere when you're introducing new food, so that it is not as intense and overwhelming. Because that's the thing about a sensory experience, a sensitivity. When it is negative, it's because of the intensity generally. It's so much that it crowds everything else out. So stimming and fidgeting both, they serve slightly different purposes, but they both serve the purpose of drawing attention elsewhere to decrease the intensity of something. So give them other things. There's a reason that a lot of us like to watch TV while we eat our dinner, or whatever thing. I have the hardest time remembering to eat, and like I cannot sit there and just eat and focus on I gotta like be reading something on my phone or talking to somebody or whatever. Mm-hmm. So drawing their attention elsewhere while you're trying to introduce new things. If you're introducing a new version of a thing, like they love pasta, for example, and you're giving them some new and different pasta, don't call it pasta. because then they'll compare it often to their existing knowledge of what pasta is, and any disparity then is looked at as a negative thing. This isn't pasta. Even if all you're saying is, okay, what you usually have is pasta, this is white sauce pasta, and you're just changing it by adding some stuff to like disambiguate it. Small, I would highly recommend, this is a general piece of parenting advice, stay the F away from operant conditioning stuff when you're having to deal with anything that is related to bodily processes. Don't punish and reward when it comes to this stuff. Then you start breaking people's ability to notice their own sensations, and it becomes about pursuing punishment or pursuing reward and avoiding punishment. It gets messed up. It causes all kinds of problems on you can't stop it later on. It's a lot. Same thing with toilet training and stuff. So a lot of quick, see, this is what I always do. I spend so much time talking about terms, and then I want to give examples and I run out of time.
No, it was great. I mean, how many more examples could you have given in 5 minutes? It was impressive.
Not many more in 5 minutes, but if I had another 5, I could give a lot more.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to be nice, and I just said the 5-minute thing. Yeah.
Well, the truth is, and for those of you who are asking questions when you do, the more detailed information you give me, the more specific an answer I can give you. And I like to do general things because they're general. They apply like the 1, 2, 3, 4 of how we respond. Like, what is the sensitivity? How do we go about it? Look into variables, blah, blah, blah. That applies to any sensitivity issue. But it doesn't give you a lot of actionable stuff. General is broadly applicable, but not very actionable. Specific is very actionable, but you got to give me a lot of specific information in order. Otherwise, I'm taking a specific request and giving an answer to information that isn't specific to you. If I were to say, oh, cotton is great, I don't know what's going on with you and your family and your child, yourself, or whatever. So we don't want information from other sources and other experiences and act as though it's going to apply to you. It might, but that's why we want to talk about the reasonings behind it.
I love that part. I'm all for that part.
Yeah. Well, thank you for keeping me on time, because otherwise I would want to sit here and give a bunch of other specific thoughts and recommendations.
Yeah. Maybe someday the stream will be 2 hours.
Oh, food, color. That also matters sometimes. Not just texture, but color. And temperature. And spiciness. If people have food aversions of any kind, generally you're going to want to avoid spiciness. An experience which is already intense for people who don't have a sensitivity is going to tend to be really intense for people who do have a sensitivity. All right, make me stop, Caleb.
You're explaining my whole childhood, Brandon. Thank you.
Since this is make when we talk about it in this way, the neurodiversity way, instead of, oh, it's just some why is Caitlin so terrible at eating spicy food? What? That's not a thing. Anyway.
Well, I was so happy to be here today. I am so happy to be here today, and I don't know, what do we say? This is not therapy hour, and
I was gonna say same bat time, same bat channel, but earlier this week I said send out the bat signal, and you didn't know that reference. So
no, but you're helping me, man. I got it.
That channel is in the 1960s Adam West version of Batman. At the end of the episode, they say, we'll be back next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.
There we go.
And yes, Caitlin will be around, if not every week, most of them, or at least that's the plan.
We're hoping, yeah.
Even when Maria's back, it'll be the 3 of us. Yeah, cool.
A trio.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I don't know how to sign off of this, so.
Say goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you. Oh, did you mean technically? I have to.
Yeah.